my background in AR and VR actually goes back a really long time, which is a weird thing to say in this industry. So I was doing VR in graduate school in 2001. Wow. How long ago is that?
He's old, y'all.
18, it was 18 years ago? Oh my God. I was doing it back then when it was something that no consumer would ever be able to have. It was big, heavy rigs hanging from the ceiling, all wired, really hard to calibrate. But the experiences were actually really similar in a lot of ways. The designs were similar. So I did that, and then my background's originally in performing arts, so playwriting, screenwriting, acting, and I also had computer science background. So when I got out of school, I was like really scared to go to Los Angeles and audition. So I went into video games, and which is brutal and really hard to get into too. So and I did that for about 10 years, and to be honest, my hope was I was gonna like change storytelling in video games. Well, that didn't happen, but I worked like 70-hour weeks and got laid off a lot, like a lot of us do, and learned a lot. And then I eventually went out on my own and started Part-Time Evil. And I guess we'll give the background to how Part-Time Evil started later. Yeah. But, and here we are.
I'm Chen Zhang. For those of you who don't know, we are married.
No, nobody wears rings ever.
You don't have to clap. It's not a huge achievement. It just is.
No rings. Life partners.
Life partners. So I'm the CEO of Part-Time Evil, and how I got started is like my background is actually starting in agency world. So I worked with a lot of lovely people here at Schematic all the way back in 2008 when we were making flash banner ads, and I thought that was like the coolest thing ever. And landing pages and click-through rate, and that was my life. But then after that, it seems like I sort of made a goal of just working in the same 3-block radius of downtown Austin. So I went to HomeAway and led brand communications efforts there. And then I went to Razorfish, and then I went to Map My Fitness, which was acquired by Under Armour. And then I went to Frog. And then after doing that, and being client-side and agency-side, I felt like I really wanted to do something that was my own thing. So I consulted at Part-Time Evil with Matt for a while, and I was like, you know what, this feels right. And like, we work pretty well together. Let's make it real. So in 2017, I joined full-time. So Part-Time Evil is a immersive storytelling studio. And what started as a mobile video game company that Matt started back in 2012 very quickly evolved to him being asked to do gamification consulting, and then 3D experiences in gaming, and then AR, VR. So sort of like with the curve of the market, as that demand grew, people were seeking out talents that could help them execute on this new thing called AR and VR.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. We said we'd go into that a little bit because sometimes there's people that want to start their own company. And so the way it started was, it was just me, it was no funding, made a game. The App Store was brutal, didn't do very well, but people saw it and it helped with like business development. And then because it was just me, by that point we had a couple other people, we started to get like more straight up like gamification consulting and like video game design inside of other apps with agencies type consulting. Like we did one with one of the largest retail stores in the world where we were making like a video game-ified version of a like bridal registry, like crazy stuff like that. And then so we started to do more of that and started to get a little more reputation, and then finally got big enough where like we got over the chicken or the egg thing of like, would people trust us with projects? And then we did the first one and did a good job, and then it just kept churning. So for people that were like looking to start their own thing and have $0 like I did, no rich uncles, nobody had any money for me. That's how you do it. You just start small, and then you just start doing bigger things, and then eventually you get help. And that's why it took so long too. So
So where we are today is we're still a small studio. We have about 12 people. There are 3D developers, designers, strategists, and Matt and I are still very much involved in the work. And we've also spun out a separate technology company based on tech that we built in-house, working on VR short films. But we'll get into all that. So facts, fiction in the future. Really wanted to do alliteration, so I'm basically jamming everything into these 3 topics. So with facts, we're just gonna tell you guys about some of the projects we've done, the state of the state as we see it, and the technology as it stands today. Fiction in the future is more speculative. We'll talk about some common misconceptions we hear in our work, and then our thoughts about the future. So the point of this slide is to say that like a lot of people come to us and say, I want you to build an AR thing, or like AR is really cool, let's do something with that. But obviously, as everyone in this room knows, it's like strategy and the way you design the experience is critical for the success. Just because it's AR doesn't mean anyone cares about it. Just because it's VR doesn't mean anything. It can still be really terrible. We've seen a lot of those. So facts. We'll start out with virtual reality. We'll show you guys a couple case studies, and then we'll move into augmented reality, because they are converging, but they're still different things today, different topics with different considerations. So we separated those 2.
So everybody knows the common platforms. I think recently people have heard a lot more about Oculus, and there are like several different platforms. So they have like the casual platform, the Go, and then they have like it'll step up until you get to the tethered systems. And the same, actually, Vive has a lot of those, but most of them come out in China first, but like they have sort of like sister products to all the Oculus products right now. Gear VR is something that was pretty common. You know, it snaps in your phone. It's something that we don't do as much of anymore. And then the lower row is more the enabling platforms. So most VR and AR is done in Unreal Engine and Unity, which if you're not familiar with, they're, to put it super duper simply, are the things where you program all the logic and set up all the things that are gonna happen, and then put all the art in there, and then they are actually renderers too. So they're sort of all-in-one packages that will spit things out to the above row. So probably the one thing worth noting is that there is some exception. AR sometimes is not done with Unity and Unreal, are more for really heavy 3D interactive applications. There are a lot of really good tools that are native to Apple and to Google now that do AR. And one thing we might talk about later is like there's a big future in web-based AR.
That's true.
And that's like something that a lot of our clients are saying, please give this to us. It's somewhat limited right now, but it's going to be big, because we can all imagine how in AR you walk up to something in the world, you just want to learn about it, but you don't want to install an app. So it's just like, let me go to austinparking.com, bring this up, and it shows me like all the open spaces down the street. Okay, and then I don't need to look at that again.
So I think for the next couple slides, we'll just talk about various use cases that we've come across in this case. And some of these are our projects, some of these are not our projects, but we wanted to add to kind of just fill out the presentation. So we'll just go through each one real quick, and if you have a burning question, please feel free to ask. So I'll just kick off this project. So this was with a media server company who has, they're global. They offer an experience in which you can upload any media you have, and then they put it in the cloud so you can access it anywhere. So you have a bunch of like old CDs, you have a bunch of movies that you own on DVD, and you want to upload that to the cloud so you can watch it Netflix style. This company enables you to do that. What we helped them with was create a virtual environment to allow a co-watching experience in VR. So if Matt was traveling in Florida and I was here in Texas, we could enter a virtual environment together and watch The Simpsons or, Broken. I don't watch TV.
You were going to say Breaking Bad?
Breaking Bad. I was like, Broken Bad doesn't sound like a TV show. I don't know.
You've never seen
I've never seen Broken Bad. All right, let's move off of that. If we wanted to watch a TV show together, we could do so in a virtual environment as avatars. So this was a project that we worked on, and they actually had a specific hardware choice in mind. So the client came to us and said it needs to be Gear VR, which is difficult because you're essentially rendering a 3D environment on your mobile device. So the limitations in terms of what we could do in this environment were quite high. So, do you want to talk about some of those limitations and the challenges?
Yeah, well, some of the Unity users out there might know that, or Unity and Unreal, that mobile VR is very different right now from non-mobile, like tethered VR, which has essentially a PC to power it. So we've found over the years that it's more different than you would expect, especially from me with having experience on like mobile video games versus Xbox and PS4 video games. The difference is even larger, and part of that is when we built this project, you truly had to render everything twice. You still kind of do these days. There's some things in Unity and Unreal that are like single pass rendering things, but it still is not as efficient as just one thing. So if you notice in that environment there, it's pretty in my opinion, but we had to be very careful about the amount of textures that are in there and the amount of vertices, they call them. So if you're not familiar with 3D art, like the corners and everything of the 3D objects, if those get too detailed, it won't run quickly enough. And this was a really interesting case study for performance because their viewers are, number one, the flat video that's in 3D has to run at 30 frames per second like a television. And if it doesn't, nobody will use it because this is all about media. So not only did it have to run in somewhat performant fashion in VR, but it had to let a certain amount of cap space for video playback, which is not cheap on mobile either. So it was a really interesting learning experience.
Yeah, so this is for casual users, and the expectation was someone could just put their Android phone into this Gear VR and experience this. But this app actually did not get a great rating in the App Store because of those performance problems that we talked about. So because we had a specific hardware that we had to deliver this experience to, and so much of the capability of that phone was taken up by running the Simpsons episode. Like what was left over for the VR experience was dismal. And so that's, I think, the key learning there, and the key takeaway is like when you're thinking about hardware choice, yes, there's ease of use, yes, there's like availability to audience, but there's also like, are you going to be able to deliver the optimal experience that you would expect, your customers would expect, and your clients would expect? Do you have a question?
I do. What was the impact on battery life on the phones?
That's probably terrible.
It's not good.
Not good.
No.
Probably got real hot too.
I think you could watch a 2.5-hour movie, but if you came into it halfway through the day, probably not. It would last a while, but there's kind of a tangential problem that was created relative to that, which is like sometimes the phones themselves would slow themselves down because the battery starts to get lower or it gets warm. So it's a really hard thing to QA.
So
Yeah.
for entertainment, it's like I think the big takeaway for us has been, mobile VR, everyone has it, but you really need a tethered option to achieve the visuals and the quality that you're looking for, and we'll get into that a little bit later with our film. Look, our film. Good timing. So this is a project, like a labor of love that we've been doing internally at our studio for a very long time. So Matt's a writer, so he wrote a script, and we set out to create like a Pixar level quality, but in a VR interactive film. And so this is a project we've been working on for 2 years now, 2.5 years.
Yeah, like 2.5 years. And talk about mobile VR. We started thinking that maybe it might be a good idea to do that, and then we made some scenes in there, and we were just like, this isn't like what we have in mind. Like we were trying to do the style that would fit mobile VR, and we were just like, there's no style in mobile VR that's going to fit what we're trying to do. Even like this right now, the film is like a hybrid of a real-time / 360 video experience to achieve this level, because it will not run on anything. But that's the vision, and like one of the key points I think with film is like you got to make what your script demands. Like so, we started out with mobile VR, and we had like a moment where you had to like really think about what we were trying to do, and we were like, nah, we got to go tethered, and we got to go like, what is the latest computer out there?
If I really wanted to embarrass us, I would have included a screenshot of the mobile VR version, which would have horrified all of you in this room.
Yeah.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, can you make that? What happened to the rendering?
To the renderer?
Yeah,
Like what happened to it?
yeah, like did it go slow?
Yeah, it actually on mobile, if we ran this on the mobile VR, it would just stop. Like that's pretty much what it would do. On a like a lower level PC, it will run at an acceptable thing to know what's going on, like 15 frames per second. And then on a good PC, it will run pretty fast. But that's why we've included like some sort of pre-rendered background elements in order to be crafty and make up for some of that.
We'll do a deeper dive on the film because it's
Yeah.
also interactive. So there's a lot we want to talk about in terms of like perspective and presence in VR and how that impacts the experience and all the decisions you have to make around whether you're third person, first person, second person. So we'll do a deep dive and you'll see more screenshots. So obviously another big use case for VR is education and training or like edutainment. So when clients come to us, I would say 75% of the asks we get are around training and education. And it's because it's like low-hanging fruit right now in training and education. It's just like, it's such an easy sell. Like, oh, instead of reading a manual or watching a video, I could step into this environment and learn how to like repair this air conditioner or do this other task I need to do. So if the cost can be managed and the production is done in such a way that it's not exorbitant, it's like really great cost savings down the road in terms of information retention. In this case, this was an entertainment product, but we'll get into the education stuff later. So this is a project that was for a nonprofit that wanted to deliver concert experiences to sick kiddos in hospitals who could not attend these experiences. And so the artist would like dedicate a concert to them and they'd be able to watch from their hospital room. So it was really an impactful project. And there's some interesting design, I would say innovation that Matt had to do to get this to work.
Yeah, we had to do, some of these kids couldn't like move, and sometimes they'd be in different positions. So there's no way to predict that. So we ended up doing this thing where it was like, depending on your orientation, it would like give you a sort of like a setup time where it would say stay still, and then whatever position you were in would become up and down. So like it would change like we actually had like a tennis ball where we had like draw axes on it because it became very confusing. So it was like we have to rotate it and then we have to like turn it. And so yeah, it was basically just like orienting it to the world. And since then I've actually noticed like some of the Oculus stuff natively will do that. And it's because people keep watching Netflix in bed. It's not anything like for humanity. That's actually the number one thing that when we go to like conferences, I ask casual users of VR, what is the number one thing you use it for? And most people say, I like to watch Netflix when my partner is asleep. I'm like, there's so many things that you should read and go to sleep. But that is what people say.
So obviously like a huge entertainment use case in VR. And then, we'll talk a little bit about the difference like 360 video versus like rendered. Obviously one is way more expensive than the other. One is also way more resource intensive, both in terms of production, but also in terms of the hardware required to run it. But in this case, it was just shooting a concert in 360 video and allowing the kiddo to have very simple navigation to go next or forward. This was a pretty interesting one. So this is for a telecom company who was seeing a lot of turnover in the technicians they hire in field. So basically these are the people you'd have to call when like your cable's broken and they have to like sometimes go in like weird crawl spaces and figure out if your cable's messed up. And so they were seeing high turnover because there were times when they would have to be like 30 feet off the ground and people didn't know the realities of the job. So they'd come to work first day, they were like, oh, I was just in a crawl space with a bunch of rats and cockroaches and I'm out. Like, I don't want this job. And so they were like, how do we both prepare people for the realities of this job while assessing their tolerance for being in potentially nerve-wracking or uncomfortable situations. So what we built for them was a 360 experience that simulated some of these environments, but also read their heart rate, not as a way to say if your heart rate is elevated, you're out of the job, but really to create material and context so the interviewer can follow up and say, I noticed you seemed really nervous during this. Like, what is your experience with spaces that are tight, or what is your experience with heights? So this was like I think a pretty interesting use case for 360 video. I mean, the execution of it was quite simple. They would just rate how they were feeling, but at the same time, we were just reading their heart rate. But I think the applications for sort of job assessment and interview assessment was quite interesting.
Yeah, and you said 30 feet. It was actually 300 feet.
Oh, really?
It was actually a scary height. Like 30 feet is like
scary.
somebody's on that corner right there. And just, it was a scary height.
I don't remember. It's a while
Like
ago.
this thing in the corner is what they were on top of. It was really high. But the crazy thing is in like VR, you actually do feel the height. That was like when I was in grad school, I remember that was the number one thing they told me is they were like, if you want to get somebody like in the chest, like and have them actually feel something, put them up high because people seem to like perceive height in VR. So this was like kind of a cool one because it is truly a test of people's fear. They will kind of react even though they don't know it's real.
Oh, another like research-backed use for VR is people that have fears and exposure therapy, and that's actually backed by some pretty significant university research that's been done for a number of years.
So this one actually is kind of interesting from a technical perspective because the concept was sort of like the thing where you go to the place and you're a Ghostbuster. It's like that one where it's like a location-based thing. Has anybody done that one? It's called like the Void.
Void.
Yeah. They so you actually are wearing a PC on your back, and if you know, like there are some desktop PCs that are pretty small. They're like called mini PCs or something. So you basically would be wired, bless you, and wearing this on your back. But these people wear equipment on their back anyway to do these jobs, so it's like not an odd thing. And the idea would be to like train them in the real world, because I guess like the main cost savings, like a lot of this stuff people come to us with, is if there's some big physical component to what you're doing for a job. Like we had someone come to us one time where it was cleaning a nuclear reactor. So you could see how that could be cheaper because like you don't want to train somebody on site unless you have like many redundant levels of other people that are making sure they're safe and not doing anything wrong. So it was those kind of jobs that involve like big physical cost. And it's kind of cool because those jobs are like not going to go away. Like there's always going to be very large, dangerous machines that people need to maintain. So the idea is you can get them like 70% of the way there, and then they can go do the expensive thing and hopefully have more success from the start.
Yeah, this was actually like this project was going to be a very big investment for them but it was like oil rig safety and oil and gas, and there's a ton of money in that. So for them, if they have to interview, let's say 100 technicians, it's cheaper for them to spend a lot on a VR experience and be able to interview 100 to 1,000 technicians and test them on their safety knowledge in VR as opposed to flying them off to an actual rig and doing that there. Yes.
Would their experience or inexperience using VR tools hinder their interviewing abilities?
That's a very good question. So that's like a huge design concern, right? Is that the challenge of using tethered VR is something that's playing into how they're being assessed essentially in this situation. But so our goal is always to design something that's dead simple. So in this case, like there's controllers, and those can often be very confusing. So it's like one button to point and click. So anything beyond that is like for a normal person who doesn't use VR day to day is too much lift. So it's really like a put on, start, point, click, and go. So it should be that simple. But that is something we think and talk about all the time, is who is the
like,
user.
One thing that's kind of relevant to what she said is like the idea that the days of the controller are sort of limited. You know, like we've done experiences where we used hand tracking, and it's already pretty good. It just, obviously, if it's on your head and it's looking at your hand and then you turn and it can't see your hand anymore, you know, those kind of concerns. But like, I think that will be the moment. Remember when like the iPhone came out and you would swipe And I remember when my first friend got the iPhone, I was like, holy shit. Like, you just swipe and you swipe and you see all your contacts. Now that seems crazy because every phone is like that, but it seems so intuitive. And it was like, that's just what I would do. And I think that moment is coming with VR where it's like, the first time interview, it'd be like, okay, just put these on and get comfortable with the fact they're on. Now you're in a place, go grab the thing that's a hook. Okay, I got it. You know, like you're not going to feel it, but you could see the hook moving around with your hand then. So I think that will be an interesting moment for VR training is when like the hand tracking works in such a way where it's like back here it works and without having a million things looking at you. So that will be kind of a convergence point.
In case you haven't picked up the theme in this VR section, which is that hardware is a limiter today. And it's a huge part of our design consideration. And sometimes we talk clients out of doing VR experiences because we know that the hardware they would need to deliver what they want is either not widely adopted or it's too difficult for the audience they're targeting. Cool. This is exciting. There's a video for you guys. So the last topic I'll talk about here in the VR section is real-time production. Who here knows what real-time production is? Oh, cool, got one. So because we work in films and heavily in animation, and we use Unity and Unreal a lot, real-time production is a big part of our lives. So I'll just start this Star Wars video, and then we'll talk about it later.
We all knew that every time we make a Star Wars movie, we want to raise the bar. We wanted a certain level of suspension of disbelief, that it doesn't feel so fantastic that you're thinking about, how did they do this?
Let's find out how good we really are, folks.
So there were two things that we did using VR in production design. One was the design itself of the train. Two is the more practical version of what is the size of the train, what is the height of the train, how do we jump from car to car? When that car is tilting back and forth, how do we hold on to it? We used Stagecraft VR, powered by Epic's Unreal Engine, and really got to place ourselves in the environment. What this tool allowed us to do was to actually surround ourselves 360 with a view of what these machines would actually become. This allowed us to move things a lot more efficiently, a lot quicker. The director was able to see his vision a lot earlier, and all of us to be on board of what this actually.
Star Wars. So this is like, I think if you're not in this industry, this is a very practical use of VR that might not be immediately apparent to some of the folks in this room who don't work in films, but like every single film you see that is CG heavy now is using some element of real-time production, and in that they use VR as a tool to pre-visualize the scene to make directorial changes and set up the scene before they get into like the hardcore rendering and detailed animation, which saves a ton of time on an already very expensive process in the industry.
Yeah, and I think the other side of it is also like if a lot of you have probably seen like the making of The Lion King and making of The Jungle Book. Those two, Jon Favreau and his crew, they did real-time production in a way where they were trying to get shots in CG by using like traditional camera methods. So they have like rigs that actually, some of them actually have the weight of cameras, or they set up like, dollies, and they would be running a 3D engine and there's like nothing there. And then they're like walking around a studio getting shots, and then they like record the shot movements and then use those later to make like a rendered film. So speaking of like convergence points, a lot of people think in the industry that in a few years we'll get to the point where it'll just be shot real time like that, and then that'll be it. So like, in the case of The Jungle Book, the real actor was composited into a CG scene. So maybe like he's walking around shooting it, Favreau's shooting the scene or whatever, and or a cinematographer, and then the person's in the scene and it's composited, and then like that's pretty much it, and there's not a lot of work after it. Like right now you're going to take it and do a whole lot of polish and rendering to it. But the idea, as real-time technology gets better, maybe something like you see in Pixar or the Lion King can just happen real-time in a studio.
And I think with like, so Apple just recently made an acquisition of a 3D animation company, and so you can you can speculate that they're getting ready for their AR experience to be way more than just playing Pokemon Go, whether they're coming out with glasses or something else. So really, like, AR, VR, films, video games, this world of 3D is growing very, very rapidly, and the need to create new, better, more exciting content and have that expressed in new, better, more exciting hardware, like, we're just on the brink of that. So some of the awkwardness that we've talked about here today is very quickly going to get solved, and then it's a matter of figuring out, where does VR best fit in our lives, where does AR best fit in our lives, and what are the various use cases. Oh, last thing, VR video games, like the most obvious use case. We can talk about this a little bit.
Yeah, so I mean, video games, obvious use case in VR, but I think overall it's probably something that the audience for games versus the audience for training are not quite as disparate as one would think. Like, it seems like a lot of the money that goes into VR now actually goes into training. But games are interesting because there is we'll talk about this a little bit later, but like a really interesting point of view question. Like, I think when I started doing video games in VR, like back in 2001, we were really focused on like first person. Like, you are the headset and you're walking around. And then we started to experiment with like different viewpoints. And like one person, I told this story like last week to you, but like there was a guy that made a VR experience that he said was the world's first second person video game. And so you are a patient at a dentist's office from the view of the patient with like your mouth open, but then you are controlling the dentist's hands, drilling your own teeth. And this is in 2001. So if any of you like go on to become VR superstars, remember this guy invented the second person VR game. And I've never seen another second person game. So that was cool.
Yeah. Terrible subject matter.
Yeah, it was terrible. It was excruciating. It was a terrible thing to do. But people would do things like, one of the really good ones back then was like rafting, and he had like a custom raft, like a paddle. And so like I think we still see those design questions happening now. Like I have a friend who works on the Moss game, which is the one in the middle, and they were one of the first hits in recent years where they were like, maybe you don't do the first person thing, but I think they ran into some of the same questions we do, because they still had to have the character talk to you, because there's a weird phenomenon in any VR game or movie, I would say not so much in training, where you feel like you have to be somebody. Like, you get in there and you're like, okay, I'm watching this mouse, but who am I? Like, I feel like I can move my head, and like I have to be something in this situation. So I think that's like a really interesting question in video games. And then, on the right, obviously we have Beat Saber, which is like a different category altogether, where I think you don't have those questions, and it's more like tapping into the physicality of VR. So just like way back in the day when you had like the power pad for like Nintendo and all that, it's like this is like probably the best full body video game playing ever is VR, because you can have a game like Beat Saber where you hit with your arms, and it's like the greatest party game in many years. So that's just a really, really high level thought on that.
Undeniably fun, yet crazy simple. There's a ton of different types of AR, right? There's like glasses, where it's like Google Glass, where it's just like you're basically looking at another thing. There's like mobile. There's location-based AR, where you're not really holding anything. There's just a bunch of cameras. So we'll get into all that. And here's that same super exciting slide that shows some of the hardware.
Yeah, we can blaze through this one really quick, but like the interesting thing to say about AR is there are so many types of AR, and it's almost more interesting to think about that than VR is pretty self-explanatory, like it's one species of thing. But like up here we have RealWear, which is something I would guess most of you haven't heard of, because I hadn't heard of it until I made something for it, and that is a super duper popular headset for industry and military, and it is what I would call a HUD AR. So yeah, it's technically augmenting your reality. It does not track to the ground. So if I put something here, it doesn't stay there. But it is very hardened to the environment, it probably could go inside the nuclear thing and it could get wet if you're cleaning something outside on a job, and it will not get sand in it if you're in the military and you're in one of the many sandy places that they operate in now. So that's actually a concern that they mentioned. They said we can't use, when we were talking to them, they said we can't use XYZ headset because this sand destroys them in like 2 weeks. And in this case, it was Afghanistan. It was a few years ago. So so there's like the heads-up displays, and then there's like the ones that are head-mounted that track on the ground, and then there are probably the most common, which is phone-based, and we call it magic window a lot of times because it looks like you're looking through a magic window.
So we'll just dive right into education and training. So I'm sure there's many people in this room who's gotten a question about training in AR because it seems so obvious. It's like, what's better than watching a video of the thing than actually seeing the thing in your environment and being able to, like, the lighting matches where you are, you get a sense of scale, you can walk around it, it locks to plane. So one of our, I would say our biggest client is a pharmaceutical company in medical devices, and asked us to help design and create an app that allows kids to learn how to use an injection device that they have to use every single day for growth hormone. So it has to be super simple to use, it has to be attractive to children, and it has to teach them meaningfully about how to use a pretty complicated connected injection device. So we went through so many iterations. It's been years of working on this project. It started out as an actual video game, but what we learned when we took that in field to interview a bunch of kids in Asia is that they weren't learning anything. They were playing a game and they were making motions and interactions in the app that had nothing to do with what it takes to actually do the injection. So it was like, collect points and learn about this piece of information, but because there was like a dissociative nature between what they were learning and the motions with the actual injection motions, we had to scrap that. So we started all over, and we decided it was going to be an interactive session where you learn about the device, but at the end of the day, you had to watch these hand animations in 3D. So you could really see like the motions that someone would go through to take the cap out, put the cap in, press this, because the physicality of watching that motion is how you actually learn. And we glean this from watching like hundreds of training sessions that this company would have with patients. And so it's an interesting challenge because in AR, it's very tempting to say, like, look at that object, touch that object, but you're not touching the object. You're taking your finger and you're swiping it around on a screen. That's very different than actually manipulating a physical device. So you have to think about that disassociation and how that helps learning or how that hurts learning. So I think that was probably the biggest challenge for us. But anyway, good news, it's gone well. The testing has been really positive. Information retention is off the charts, and we are currently in the process of launching in Asia right now.
This heads-up display world is a world that's like not visible to a lot of us who don't work in like gigantic oil rigs or factories, but it's very important for like people who are doing these type of trades where a lot of it is like, this is what they call remote assistance. So you walk up to a machine that maybe you know really well, but there's a problem with it that maybe you've never seen before. And so you can call in and say, I want to go live with you. And they all have cameras. So it'll say like, it's just a live feed. It's not like an augmented reality thing. And it'll say, look at what I'm looking at. And then on your display, it'll show instructions and diagrams to how to fix it. And it's really powerful, not only because of the connectivity and the heads-up display element of it, but it's also, you're obviously working with your hands, so you can like keep working. And sometimes your hands have like hazardous materials, or you need to clean them and do this whole thing before you could go out and like touch your computer. Sometimes there are computers in there and they have covers, but this is all much more convenient and safe. So that's sort of just like, for me, was like the lay person's guide to like why these things, which sometimes, compared to like AR kit, is a little less glamorous. It's actually really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like less sophisticated, but they would have such a hard time using AR kit-based apps in the environment that they work in. AR gaming. We can probably just skip right over this. Everyone's played the new Harry Potter game, right? You see a thing, it knows where you are, a little dude pops up, he's cool. It's pretty basic. It's still one of the best applications of AR. I would also say Snapchat is probably one of the top application of AR. And like the people just want to look awesome, and like they enable that through AR. Location-based AR entertainment. So this is one where, you know, there's many different types of AR, but in this case, you walk up to this giant touch screen. There's a crazy camera setup that Matt will get into, and it's recognizing your skeletal motion, and it applies that to a character that is essentially magic mirroring back to you. But instead of the character's face, it's your face. So you become this character. So this is an interactive location-based experience. And this is purely for entertainment. Like I can't really think of another applicability other than to do something really fun and cool and become Supergirl. Do you want to talk about the tech a little bit?
Yeah, a little bit. I also want to talk about preparation. So one thing that's really important with AR is like, it's impossible to properly test it. It is there every time you look at something, it's a different thing. So one thing we've learned over the years is like there's always a new problem on site. So I had this one professor in graduate school at Carnegie Mellon who I loved. His name is Randy Pausch. He wrote this book called The Last Lecture right before he passed away, and he was like a real mentor to mine. But he always said, he was kind of old school, so he's like, if you go to do a presentation and they have an overhead projector, find out what bulb it has and bring an extra one. Well, I always try to take that to heart, but this thing had like a whole new problem where we were on like a Hollywood set and there was like a union crew, and the hertz of the LED lights were the perfect amount to mess up our cameras, and we weren't allowed to change them because it was a union crew. So we had to end up building like a tent around the thing. So I think that's the number one, like if anybody like wants to have my impression about like really rolling out AR that's not just a toy or not something like that's a cool demo, is that it's very difficult to test, and you can never test it in all situations. So you have to like try to test it in low light, high light, like weird reflective surfaces, things like that. So
yeah, that's a really good point. Actually, one thing I want to mention about that the medical device training app is we had to build an entire mode that's non-AR mode. Not just because there's devices that don't support it, but if you use it on a black surface or a white surface, it literally will not recognize that surface, rendering the experience unusable. So we had to create an entire separate mode that detects what situation you're in and turn on non-AR mode. And I'm pretty sure Pokemon Go does the same thing because they recognize that you cannot control for someone's physical environment, and you have to build extra capability into your app to account for that. Hey, look, it's Bose.
Bose. Somebody mentioned Bose earlier.
We did a concept for them around storytelling, but the whole point of this slide is just to say that not all AR is visual. Sometimes it can be audio-based AR, which is really exciting.
Yeah, it was basically like a movie, like a 3D movie with no visuals. It's really cool.
And it was interactive. It's pretty cool. So to kind of follow up on our real-time production, I also wanted to talk about production tools using augmented reality. So I will play another video for you guys. So this is a product that we actually made to work on our VR film. So it uses ARKit on the phone and the depth camera, and we apply some proprietary technology to capture really accurate facial animations, which you can then apply into your video game or your film. And it really cuts down time, because typically what you do today is you book studio time to go and have a really crazy hardware setup. It has a bunch of cameras, put a bunch of dots on your face, and then you capture basically the same quality. So what we've done is taken something that's very complex, very expensive, very time consuming, and made it work on the iPhone 10. So you can do offline capture, which is capture export, or you can live animate. And this is for, I don't know if you guys know, like virtual YouTuber people, like people that live stream as characters. So this is a use case for them. Or you can like record and stream directly into like a game or some other type of visual experience. When you're working and like constantly pushing the boundaries of the tools that exist out there today and the products and the hardware, sometimes we run across problems where like people are basically using legacy technology, and we have to be very clever about either making our own thing or trying to find someone somewhere in the world who's creating a product to solve our problem. In this case, we couldn't find that person, so we made it our own thing. Turns out other studios thought it was pretty cool, so it's now a separate company, and we provide this product to video game and film studios. Okay, so this is the part where it's like more interactive, and you guys can ask us questions. This is where we speculate about the future, and then talk about some misconceptions or some ideas that we've heard or that we even had about this space before we started working. So first one, VR adoption. Like, who here has a VR headset in their house? Yeah, that's pretty bad in terms of like consumer level. And we have no way of knowing what you have. You could have Gear VR, you could have an entire crazy Oculus Rift set up in your house. Like, there's no way of predicting.
I like how like the person that said they're developing for VR didn't have a headset. So that must mean you two are friends. Right? Okay. So yeah, I think we're not VR evangelists. That's like sort of what we always try to portray in any of these talks we've done, is because for me, like, I've been doing it for a while, and I think like I'm more like a storyteller, where it's like whatever's clever, I'll tell a story with it. But like VR, the problem really is, when it comes down to it, is like people don't want that thing on their face. Like, it doesn't matter if it's light, heavy, if it's easy to turn on. Like, most of the people, we do a lot of case studies, and like there's two types of like VR. Let's like not get too detailed about training and all this. Like, there's two types of main VR usage. It's like, I'm at an event like South by Southwest. I'm at work for training. I'm at a location-based event like at a Comic-Con. Well, for me personally, that's a super awesome place to use VR, and I like want to try it. Then there's like, I'm alone in my house and I just worked 8 hours and drove home, and I like want to do something fun that does not make me work hard, right? So like, I think that's the difference that I personally have learned a lot about that over the years, is that like those two use cases are very different. And I think that's why my friend's game with the mouse does pretty well, because it is sort of like you're just chilling and you're like moving the mouse and you're seeing a beautiful story, but it's not like you're in this thing and you're looking all around and standing up the whole time necessarily. And I think that's like the really pragmatic like way of looking at it. We are at a lot of events where I think a lot of us VR people do a lot of like the song like wishing and a hoping. Like, we do a lot of wishing and a hoping that like the next VR headset that comes out is going to be everybody has in their house. And that's not true. Like, there's certain things people want to do with VR in their house, and there's certain things that are really, really catching on for like all sorts of spaces, to the point where it might be like every car dealership in the world has one, every architectural firm has one, maybe a lot of design firms have them, but like, and you might always have one at your house, but it might be something that you don't use in the same way. This is like a super UX thing that is more Chen's area, but like you might not use it with the same pattern that you just watch TV, and TV will probably stay as a thing in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a reason why Oculus has turned a lot of their time investment and money investment into enterprise uses for VR, because they're seeing that consumer adoption is just not there yet. It costs a lot of money, the value's not quite there, and frankly, like it hurts my face, and I don't want it there for longer than 5 minutes. This is something, I do this for a living, so there's a lot of things that people have to figure out there. This is where you get to see a bunch of cool screenshots of our movie, and we'll talk about the concept of perspective and interaction. We
went through a lot of soul searching with what the perspective would be in our film for the VR version.
You should tell them what the film is about, so they understand why there's a perspective problem. Yeah, so the film is I think the thing that's cool about it is it sort of looks like a Pixar-y type 3D film, but it is a little bit less kid-centric. So it's about this character, who's the character you see right on there, who has a great relationship with her daughter, sort of a mother-daughter tale. And the main character dies tragically, and then
returns as different parts of nature. And it's sort of like, does the daughter know? Does she not know? And then eventually they reconnect in sort of a mysterious way. So for us, like, perspective is really important. And we like went back and forth a lot with, we initially insisted that everything, well, we initially were going to do cameras. And that's when we were like, wow, even in a film more than anything, it's really heavy how like you feel like that character's talking to that character, but I feel like I'm a third character and I'm not anybody. And that seems really strange. And it's hard to explain unless you're in that scene. And it seems like less of a deal when you're in training or you're in a video game. But then when you're in like a dramatic scene in a film, it seems like a really big deal. Especially when the film starts to like look good. It's like the better it looks, the worse the problem is. And because you just start to have this like presence. And so then we were like, you have to be first person no matter what. And then we felt like it started to feel like a simulation of a film or something like that. And it started to feel like the first person character was you. And we wanted, this is just a choice of ours. We wanted to have full control of the narrative. We didn't want to be like, there are a lot of films at Film Fest that are like hybrids where you're like throwing stuff and it's just sort of like a world you're in. Well, we wanted to like have narrative control. So eventually we like, well, Chen had this idea actually, because we were like churning on this first person thing where it's like, why don't we try over the shoulder? And so we tried over the shoulder, and then we like made all these camera controls so the over the shoulder sort of like varies in distance based on like the intimacy of the scene. So like in this scene, you're like really close and kind of like still see your character.
These aren't concept shots, by the way. This is all fully rendered in 3D.
Yeah.
So we don't sleep much, and neither does our team. But it's only a 12-minute film, but we've been working on it for 2 years. So like, 3D is tough.
Yeah, it's tough. So like, yeah. Anyways, the takeaway for that is like the perspective. The more like emotional and intimate like a VR experience is, the more that perspective thing will like really stick out if you don't get it right. So what we ended up doing was like doing first, like this scene, you are an animal. And so like when you're animals or non-human things, you're always first person. And when you're human, you're in over the shoulder. So it took like a year to figure out that scheme.
But it's also a really unique story that is best told in VR because of all the like perspective shifting and the fact that you take on different characters and you develop a relationship with your daughter as these different entities. And we built in interactivity, so there's eye tracking. So as your eyes move, theirs move, and there's reflections, and reflections in water or windows are how you figure out who you are and what you are in that particular moment. So it started out, like this is something we couldn't have achieved on mobile VR. It just wasn't possible to get to this level of quality. Here, you're a bird. That's pretty cool.
Flying on up.
And in the last scene of the movie, we made a choice for you to be a third-person camera for the first time in the movie as sort of a way to kind of wrap up the fact that her particular journey being trapped as an animal has ended, and she is now something else.
Yeah, we just figured we'd try something new, like from a story perspective, and we were like, well, it's going to be pretty obvious that we're doing these other things, so like maybe at the end, when they like reunite, you would be a third-person camera, and it's like, well, you have this impression that you are something, so what are you? Maybe you are like not them, maybe you're like her spirit, or maybe you're just observing and you're like free. But we don't want to tell them what that is. I think that's sort of why we made that decision, is like, let's just let people think. It would be better that way.
Yeah, so this was a really interesting use case in using perspective as a part of the storytelling, and presence as a part of the storytelling. But yeah, it did take us like a year and a half to figure this out, so it's not...
Oh yeah, and probably the really interesting part that we didn't mention is like in the film festival version, it's actually like a location-based thing, and you can co-watch it where one of you's the daughter and one of you's the mother, and then in the last scene, you are the same camera. So it's like, oh, you're together in a way, but yeah. And you're supposed to talk about it afterwards.
It's supposed to elicit an emotional response with a stranger that you're sitting next to at the film festival. AR glasses. Who's tried a magic leap here? What'd you think? What'd you think about it? Yeah. Who thought it was like the best thing they've ever seen? I would guess nobody in here, because it sucked. It sucked. It was hot.
There's a Magic Leap office in Austin.
Okay, sorry if you work there. It hurt my nose. Like I'm Asian, so I have like a shorter nose bridge, and like that means all the pressure was on my like ocular bone instead of being like distributed. And I was like, well, this is biased design. So it was like right with issues, and so this very hyped experience turned out to be able to deliver like a visual experience that was like way lower than any of us would tolerate. So it's like, yes, the tech is cool, but if what you see sucks, and if wearing it on your face sucks, no one's ever going to use it. They're also chasing an enterprise use case, by the way.
Yeah.
They've pretty much dropped consumer stuff altogether.
We've talked to them at a couple of conferences, and what they're trying to do is really hard. I think in some ways it's just not possible yet. So like, hats off to the people there. It's just not doable yet. And I think the only thing that was done wrong was there was a little over-promising with some of the initial videos. But there was people speculating about Apple coming out with glasses, and I always said that if they come out with glasses anytime in the next like 3 years, it's going to be a heads-up only. If some of you work for Apple, you can like just wink. But it's like a heads-up only thing, like the real wear, but really well done, and sort of like the watch where it like tells you what your messages are and such. But the tracking thing and the field of view is just, there's some scientific like limits to that.
Mobile AR, that's like the most widely used AR use case today. Like I mentioned earlier, there's some like really interesting things to think about with like mind-body connection and the types of the way you manipulate and how that helps with whatever task they're doing in that experience. But I mean, other than that, the limitations are just that you have to hold a phone up and you have to download an app, unless you're doing web AR, which is getting very good, but still can't support some of the more interactive, some of the higher res experiences.
Yeah, and I mean, the main thing like about mobile AR that I always say that we've learned is like, if you're talking about mobile AR, like this type of AR, then you're talking about computer vision. And if you're talking about computer vision, then you're always talking about machine learning. So like, they're pretty much all like one in a lot of the work we do. And I think a lot of the value to people in the non-demo-y Pokemon space is going to be like, really responsive, long distance recognition of stuff joined with GPS, where you can be like, that's that thing, that's that thing, that's that thing. I'm at an amusement park. I know what everything is. That kind of scary in a way, but also very useful. So,
Questions?
I was thinking that's based on the superhero AR match experience you showed. Has anyone been doing that or doing it really well with like online shopping for apparel?
We've seen a couple of startups do that for online shopping, but it's usually like it'll be in the store. So if you want to try on stuff that isn't there, you can try on additional things. Fit is kind of an awkward thing because it's tracking your skeleton. So like the width that you are and your general like fleshy proportions, it's not amazing at recognizing that yet.
yeah,
But
it doesn't know what's like beyond your skeleton. So like the ones that are in person, the reason why those work so well is they have like whatever type of infrared cameras we want to throw out there. We can have as many as we want. And so that will actually like map your 3D skeleton. And then that's why like you see a lot of the ones with the makeup and stuff, it's really nice because it's infrared based.
another interesting thing is like, do you have 3D models of all of your inventory? Which, yeah, with like volumetric video, I think that's becoming cheaper, much quicker. But again, it's like an operation that a company has to like add to the 20 other things that they, 2,300 other things that they do. So for a lot of companies, like the ROI is like debatable, but the technology is there. Yes.
You mentioned like a pharmaceutical company having to do several rounds of testing, right, to make sure it's okay for the kids. Like, is that full-blown dev?
No, we do sketches. So the sketch you saw with that guy in the backpack learning about oil and gas training, that we will do that until they say, yes, I understand, and this is what I want. So we don't do, like, we'll prototype every now and then, but people have to see things in a way that they understand. And like sometimes until you get to that, until you get to the point of being like, yes, 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 in the room, we make art, we draw stuff. So the drawing can be the context that the user's in, the drawing can be what they're seeing in the screen, but sometimes that's the best way to communicate to a client, like, here's this idea. And sometimes like we have fine artists on staff, they'll make like a painting and it's like beautiful, but it like gets the vibe across, like the mood. But we found that that's the best way. Like obviously it's hard to do in an Envision thing if it's gonna be 3D, so we draw.
Have you all heard of Adobe's Adobe Aero that they're testing? Their new product line that's going to be enabling people to make AR experiences.
Oh, that's really cool.
I haven't heard about that one. Eighth Wall is another good one for spinning up AR stuff. Like if all you need to do is have someone see something on a plane, there's like a number of really nice tools that allow you to do that with very little dev work. So I guess I answered this gentleman's question thinking about something that was like really complex that you would have to like interact with the virtual environment. But yeah, for simplistic things, I've never heard of Aero, but that we'll look into that. That's a good one. And then Eighth Wall is another really good, easy one.
Yeah, and a lot of those they're somewhat limited in that like you couldn't do anything like super custom with them, and generally like the same thing happened with VR and mobile apps before that. And like what we always try to do, especially when you're doing mobile apps, was like, if it's about to become commoditized, then we stop doing it. So if back in the day, it used to be like putting things in front of other things in AR was like really hard to do. And now, like you said, there's a tool for it. So we want to probably not do that stuff anymore because it's going to be like, same thing happened with the beginning of websites, right? Like everybody was like making a lot of money just making websites. And then all of a sudden came like Squarespace and WordPress, and you're kind of maybe talking about like an analogous thing to those type of tools. So in my experience, we try to stay like, once it becomes like that, then we're like, okay, we're not doing that
also,
anymore.
like people don't come to us for stuff like that because
Yeah,
they can
and
do it themselves.
We don't have to actually, we probably don't consciously choose. People just stop. They do it themselves. Yeah.
Yes.
At your studio, how would you say y'all's work is split between like actual product development and innovation?
I'd say we've been like really innovation, maybe too innovation heavy in the last like couple years. We've had like a big investment period where we've been like doing products for clients and like just investing it all into making innovation. So I'd say like at a normal clip, we'd be more in like the 20% range for innovation, especially when there was a period where mobile AR was like really new, and we were doing like small demo innovation projects where we were trying to fuse together. We had a picture of one of them where I still think it would have been cool. I won't go into detail about it, but it was like a fusion of like 5 different technologies, and it was cool to show off. So we were doing a lot of those type of things. And then like recently we started doing like these big things. So like we like the
recently it's been 50-50, but I wouldn't recommend that for anyone who's sane.
Yeah, the motion capture thing that Chen showed off was actually an innovation project that was intended as an internal filmmaking tool, and then we got interest. So now it's not innovation anymore, thank goodness. It's like it became real, and that was the first thing that ever did that. Most of the time they show off capabilities.
I will say it's been important for us to work on this film because that's where Aquifer came from, and that's where like a lot of our points of view about perspective, because clients will ask you for stuff that's been done 2 to 3 years ago. They generally don't want to ask you for stuff that's risky because it's not proven out. They're always like, give me a use case where this exact thing was successful, and I'm like, okay, I'll try to find one. But because it's so we have to, in order to stay in front of the curve and not just be making apps that have like entered into the consciousness of our clients who are a little bit behind. So we have to challenge ourselves to do crazy stuff, so that when they ask us like, oh, what should I do about here? I'd be like, well, I spent a year solving that. So let me tell you, sir, this is how you figure that out. So it's been important for us, but it's also been like obviously crazy challenging to maintain that pace with the team that we have. Yes?
Do you have any experience working in mixed reality, and where do you see that space going?
Yeah.
Like mixed in which direction? Like outward-facing camera type mixed reality?
Like physical world and VR.
Yeah, okay. I was just making sure I got it right, because sometimes I like get confused between like nowadays there's so many devices where it's like I'm seeing through the thing or I'm seeing cameras that see out. Yeah, we've done some of that. I think that like that is something that's going to start to be bigger now because of like the Oculus Quest and those type of things, because they're already built to use those cameras for tracking. So it's like a little bit more of a unified world, and like the thing that you're seeing is similar to the thing that you're like interacting with. So we did some, speaking of innovation, like we did a couple like things that turned out in strange ways where we were using like a Vive Focus, which is like an early Oculus Quest Type 5, and like trying to turn on the outward camera and have you see where you're walking and then like interact with things.
There's also a lot happening in entertainment with the type of mixed reality you're talking about. So I know at Disney, they're doing a lot of exhibits where you put on a headset, but then the physical environment responds to what you're seeing virtually. That's really cool.
I actually think like the thing you're talking about could be bigger. Like we were talking about like HoloLens and Magic Leap, which are like good for, I think, doing things that you're already doing, like occupational things. But I think like the thing he was talking about is a little more possible right now. So you could add like more and more cameras and get a much more detailed. So what he's talking about is if you have like a VR headset that's like a portable one and they have the outward facing cameras, what if you take it and you like make the VR view be what the camera sees, so you can like walk around this room and see the room? Well, I think it's easier to get that to the point where you could navigate the room and then augment it with objects than it is to go the other way, which presents like a lot of crazy optical challenges. So I do think like it's weird because that term came out a few years ago and then nothing happened with it for a while. And I think it was just hardware related.
Yes.
Regarding your film, so you talked about presence and immersion. Did you have that problem of like I did with one of my projects that when I look down there are no legs because
Oh yeah.
Yes.
Yes, that is a huge problem. Yeah, so she's asking about the thing in VR where if you look down, you have no legs. So you're like, who am I? What am I? What should I be? And that's actually a problem that we have had to figure out, which is why the over-the-shoulder thing that you saw is a good solve for that, because because traditional film works that way, you recognize that you yourself don't have presence, but you have taken on the presence of this person that you're doing the over-the-shoulder with. So like we've adopted that from traditional filmmaking and applied it in VR, and it seems to work well because it's familiar. But yeah, if it's truly first person, you look down, sometimes you're looking through your own body because the model is hollow on the inside and really creepy stuff happens.
Remember, we started to get into some really crazy stuff that had me like remembering some of my video game first person design days, because if you really want it to feel great, you have to like look down and you have to like do some kinematics with the body where like the chest moves and the like whole body is tied together. So if you like turn this way, otherwise it just feels like you're sitting on top of a head, and you actually will look down into your neck sometimes. So like it's just one of those like things where we were like, if we're gonna do this, we're gonna spend the whole project doing this right, because we kind of have a rule with the film, like if it's intrusive and it doesn't look great and it requires any instruction, we're not doing it. Like that was something. And probably also related to what you were saying was his question, where the reason I said like I don't think the like headset AR is maybe as great right now as the mixed reality is because the field of vision is the field of view is so small that like we had a Magic Leap for a while, and I actually like thought it was pretty impressive, the resolution of it. But then if things were like lower than just this amount, if I'm looking straight ahead, and the HoloLens, it has the same problem. It's invisible. So it's like not just am I looking down and not seeing my legs, but it's like I'm looking forward and I can't tell if something's down here. So that's a really strange thing that you have to like, a human doesn't usually do that because we have over 180 degree field of view naturally. And then you take it down to like 40 or 30 and it becomes really disorienting.
There's another, yes.
As far as like augmented reality, have you ever run into like motion sickness?
Yes. Yeah, motion sickness is always going to be a thing in VR.
So do you think like mixed media would be like a solve for that, if you're actually feeling the environment you're in, or?
Yeah, I think like there was this really awesome talk that was at the Facebook conference the Oculus head gave it. It was like 5 years ago, and it was like, what's going to happen by 2020? And it was like my type of talk because it was so crazy and hard for me to understand. Like most of the optical stuff was way over my head, and I was just Googling everything. And he was talking about a lot about like refresh rates, and that's like the basics of what he was talking about. But like there's a lot of things that make you sick that are not just due to like motion. It's like it is the field of view, it's the refresh rate, it's the resolution. Sometimes it's like the lack of the 6 degrees of freedom when you're moving around. So as all those things improve, and the other thing is like so Oculus had a prototype where if you focused on a farther distance, it would actually change the focus of it. So like all of those things combined will make, I think, people less sick. And then the second thing would be it depends on the individual. Because like Chen, we have a scene in our film where the deer runs for like literally just 20 yards. And she said it makes her sick. It doesn't bother me at all, but I felt super sick using Magic Leap, just like picking up blocks. And I don't know what it was because nobody else felt that way. So it's just individual basis too. You know, like we talked about like machine learning and computer vision. I think like stories that involve, I always like had this theory about like VR and AR is like, what is interesting for that particular medium? So like AR, the interesting thing is what's around you. So like it's hard to create like a purpose-built experience because you could be anywhere. So it's like, how do you build something that works anywhere? And if it's purpose-built to tell one story and it works anywhere, then it's probably not very well tied into environments because that's just a logical thing. Every environment's different. So if you have like a story about the woods and you're not in the woods, then it's not going to work very well. But if you have like an app that like tells a story based on like various things that it recognizes in the environment, or it's like, I'm going to tell you a murder mystery. I think she used a light bulb, and then you have to like find it, and it's like, oh, that's a really interesting light bulb. Now I wonder what's under it. And then it just like recognize, it's like, oh, that's a water bottle? Like that makes me think I was just in the bedroom. You know, so those kind of things to me are just like, that is built for what AR does well. But you need all sorts of good computer vision, and you need all sorts of like good machine learning to do that right.
On the like way lower end, there's a really cute app I found in the App Store called Avo. It's like a cartoon avocado that takes you through a series of short stories. But what they mix 2D video and AR Avo, and he walks around and he like does little things that you pick up, and then he tells you a story. So it kind of flips between being AR and just being video, and it's super simplistic, but the execution of it and the storytelling of it was very well streamed together, and it really felt like the AR and the video were a seamless integrated experience. So I think there's a lot of clever ways where you don't need a lot of crazy tech to tell a good story, but just about like knowing how to use the environment and knowing like if there are gaps that AR storytelling has, like how else do you fill those gaps with other mediums that are more recognizable and simple to execute.
Do you think the future of AR VR will always be something like mounted to your face, or is there already concept and talks about different solutions to that?
There's probably going to be an element of that. One thing I've always been super into that like we haven't really done a whole lot of projects for this, but we've done like a few concepts is like the idea of like a 3D projection and then combine that with like skeletal tracking and eye tracking. So like if I'm in the room and then there's stuff 3D projected around me, but then it knows where I am. So if I like turn, it reacts to me. Like I think those kind of things are cool. Like way back in graduate school, our neighbors, the University of Pittsburgh, they had the thing they used to call a cave, which is like six. It's a cube, and then it has projectors all around it, and it's like super immersive. And I always thought those kind of things are really awesome for, we had like to avoid giving anything away, a theme park-ish client. There's really awesome client that we were designing something for, and they wanted to do a headset, but I thought like the that anything adjacent to like a 3D projection that knows where you are could be really cool because you could move crowds through it, and like it's sort of VR, but it feels really free, and it's like very clean and not germ ridden, and it doesn't make anybody really sick because you can move. So that's just one example.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's some interesting, like, obviously with like audio-based AR, it's not something mounted because it's not visual, right? So the term augmented reality is so gosh darn broad. Like it's really hard to like paint all the experiences with a single brush because they are like very unique, different types, ways of augmenting your reality. Was there a question over here?
Yeah, I have two. Super interesting talk. I am amazed by what you're talking about, and I'm sitting here thinking all the time, how are you hiring? What are you looking for when you're hiring?
Where do we find people?
Yeah, where do you find people? Because I appreciate that you went to Carnegie Mellon, one of the universities that everybody looks to for grad school, amazing, but I'm pretty sure that you did not get much of that in Carnegie Mellon, the traditional way of how you're going through your education. So how do you hire new people?
Just purely like logistically, we hire a lot of people out of video game companies. But you have to find the gem in the video game company who can think outside of traditional video games because they understand 3D, but they may not understand product. They understand the technicalities of how something gets done, but they may not be great problem solvers if you take them out of their comfort zone because it's not a game what they're building. So that's like purely logistically. We also hire a lot of people right out of school. Like we just find new gems, like obviously Carnegie Mellon. I would say like most of our engineering team is from there. They're just brilliant problem solvers, and specifically Carnegie Mellon has an entertainment technology master's program, which is where Matt went, and this is what they study. And then also weirdly A&M, they have a Viz program, and this is also what they study. So that's and then just people that are good thinkers that can like think outside the box. It's like people, if they come to us and they're like, this is the way I do things, I have this process, they're probably not going to work out. Because it's so, like, everything we do is bespoke. Everything is new. There is no use case that we can fall back on and say, like, process A through Z works on, we don't have that playbook. So we have to work with people that are really flexible and comfortable with not knowing what the heck they're doing.
And so we're trying to, like, be as disruptive as we can to say, like, could we make a digital short for an efficient amount of budget? And can we like maybe create a new thing that would be on Netflix that's not choose your own adventure, but it is like, look, it's your face and you're a character and you didn't even have to put anything on your head, like crazy stuff like that. But at this high fidelity and like with our own style that we're trying to like develop, which is the Part-Time Evil style of storytelling, which is like starkly beautiful, hopefully eventually, but also intimate and not cute. Like there's enough cute CG and we're just like not really trying to do that. So like we'd rather take a little more risk because cute is less risky because there's a lot of like opportunity for like affordable cute children's shows on Netflix right now. So like, yeah, I think it is a goal, but then it also is like a way to push us so hard that we like we made a product out of it, and we've never like had a research project that became a product before, but we made it because we were like moving so fast and we were doing such this weird real-time production pipeline that we like could not find the right fit. And so I just wrote this thing and it was so gross and it worked for a while and then like it ended up becoming a thing, and then like we made it like actually be a real product, which is like 80% of the work.
Yeah, so that's like a long way of saying like we have our 5-year moonshot and then we look at the practicalities of reaching them. Obviously our passion is in entertainment experiences. Like we're not sitting up here being like, oh, I love defense training. Like that's not where my heart is. That's not why I get out of bed in the morning. But we want those contracts because they pay our bills.
And we do have people that we work with in that area, and it's like part of it is we're like, oh, you want this thing? Well, look at this film. Is it up to that, or is it somewhere in the middle? And if it's anywhere from like blocky people to like the film, we can do it.
Yeah.
And
So for
that
us,
was,
it's like,
part of
here's
it.
what we're capable of, and we can do anything from the floor up to that point. But we wouldn't know what our limit is until we tested that. So that's what the moonshots are. But again, I don't recommend it for people if you're not insane.
Thank you.
Earlier, you made a reference to edutainment, and I think you connected that back to your training. Have you ever explored or brainstormed about applications that really fit in the education space, in the classroom space, as a way to redefine how we educate students?
Sure. Yeah, I think we've done probably 1 to 2 projects is purely for educating smaller children. The trouble, like, I think just fundamentally, I personally don't feel like putting screens in front of children is something we should be like looking to achieve. Like, I think less screen time is better than more, but there's certainly like, if you think about like, okay, if you have them for 10 minutes a day and you want to be most impactful with the type of learning they're doing, I think sometimes an AR or a VR experience can be extremely powerful. But in general, yeah, there's a ton of startups and companies exploring how to bring on the next wave of education through immersive technologies. But I think I personally just like I just want them to be outside and play in the dirt. So like I don't like promote that as much, and we don't actively seek out this opportunities.
Yeah, and I actually did like a lot of educational game design. Like it was like right before I started my company, and like we. I don't know. You and I talked about that recently, about how like the balance is that like usually people's instinct is to build a game, but then you build a game and you're like, the kids know they're here to learn, and like the teacher wants them to be here to learn, and like the game is never as fun as like a game they play on PS4 or even on a phone, because you have to accomplish a specific thing. But it is like a little bit distracting and doesn't like lend to the learning sometimes. So you have to find this sweet spot. Like one time we built like a physics thing. Like physics is a little more sensible, or sometimes there's good math games. But there's certain subjects where if you like try to build games for them, it becomes like, number one, sort of distracting and time wasting. And number two, to the kid, like less is less fun. So like one thing I learned is the kids always see through the like, hey, it's a game, it's fun, you're gonna learn. And they're like, no, I know I'm here to learn. They see through it immediately. So it's a tough thing to design.
Well, thank you guys so much. Your questions have been amazing. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Lainey. Thank you, 1323.